the eat hours on the road, and my welcome was a closed door. Brooke leaned against the frame, wine glass in hand. "Oh, the engagement party? That was yesterday?" I froze on the porch, wind lifting the ends of my scarf. The box in my arms felt heavier than the drive itself. Inside, wrapped in linen, was my silver wedding cake mold, and the recipe book my husband and I had filled over 40 years. Folks, what would you do if you brought your heart in a box, only to have it refused at the door? Stay with me. This isn't just about cake. It's about what you do when your own family erases you. The air smelled faintly of rosemary from the planter by the steps. Beyond Brooke's shoulder, I caught flickers of movement. Shadows crossing a lit room, the rise and fall of laughter. The music was low, a lazy jazz tune, the kind you play when you want people to linger. "Everyone's here for brunch," she added, as if that explained the voices, the clink of glasses. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "We thought you wouldn't want to drive so far." I almost laughed. Almost. The road from Asheville to Charleston wasn't just miles. It was hours to think of what I'd say, to picture Daniel's face when I handed over the mold, to tell the story of how my husband carved our initials into its base. Now, those words clung to the back of my throat. Brooke tilted her head, waiting for me to nod, to accept the polite lie she'd built in silk and wine. The scent of pine at Nor mingled with the salt in the air. Somewhere behind her, a woman called her name. Brooke turned already halfway back to her people. I stepped down from the porch. The wood groaned under my weight as if it, too, had grown tired of holding me up. My shoes hit the gravel, sharp, uneven, each stone pressing through the thin soles like a reminder this ground wasn't mine. The highway back toward the coast was nearly empty. I drove without turning on the radio. Wind tunneled through the cracked window, bringing the briny smell of Folly Beach before I saw it. By the time I pulled into the small public lot, the late afternoon light had gone gold. I carried the box to a bench that faced the water. The wood was warm against my palms. Gulls dipped low, their wings catching the sun, their cries sharp and distant. I opened the lid slowly, letting the linen fall back to reveal the silver mold. It was cool to the touch, its surface worn smooth in places by years of use. Between the folds of the recipe book, a slip of yellowed paper peeked out. My breath caught. It was my husband's handwriting, slanted, confident. "Value isn't about who receives it," it read, "but whether it's cherished." I traced the words with my thumb. They steadied me in a way no apology from Brooke ever could. The tide rolled in, hissing against the sand, then drew back as if to make room for my decision. I didn't have to beg for space at someone else's table. I didn't have to wait for an invitation that would never come without strings. This mold, these recipes, they weren't bargaining chips. They were the story of my life, and stories deserve an audience that listens. By the time the sun began to drop, I knew where they would go. Not to Brooke, not to Daniel, to hands that would dust flour across a counter, measure sugar by feel, and understand that love is baked into every layer. That night, back in Asheville, I placed the box on my kitchen table. The air still carried the scent of the sea. Tomorrow I would make a call, not to my son, to someone who would say yes before they knew what was inside the box. The next morning, sunlight streamed across my kitchen table. It caught the dust motes drifting in the air, turning them into tiny sparks. The box sat where I'd left it, the linen still folded neatly over the silver mold. I closed my eyes and the years peeled back. Carrington's Bakery, Asheville, North Carolina. Smelled of cinnamon rolls just pulled from the oven. The bell over the door chimed every time a neighbor stepped in. I could see my younger self behind the counter, flour on my cheek, my hands busy kneading dough. Tom, my husband, would be at the back, checking the ovens, humming a tune only he seemed to know. 2 more minutes, he'd call, peeking around the doorway with that half smile. His hair always fell across his forehead, no matter how often he brushed it back. Those were the mornings when life felt simple and solid. We opened at 6, rain or shine. The glass display case would fog at the edges from the warmth inside. Apple pies glistened under the lights, and loaves of sourdough cooled on wire racks near the back wall. The silver wedding cake mold wasn't just for weddings. Sometimes we used it to make celebration cakes for anniversaries, retirements, even a welcome home for soldiers. Each time, Tom would polish it with a soft cloth, making sure the initials we'd carved on the base shone clear. On our own wedding day, it had held a 3-tiered vanilla cake frosted with buttercream roses. I remember lifting the top tier with him, setting it on the table as our friends cheered. We didn't have much money, But the cake felt like a promise we would build something lasting. For years, we kept that promise. The bakery became a place where people marked their milestones. We knew their names, their favorite flavors, and sometimes their secrets. Tom believed every recipe carried the weight of the hands that made it. When he passed, the bakery walls seemed to echo differently. I tried to keep it going, but the mornings grew heavier without his voice. Selling it in 2022 felt like closing a chapter I wasn't ready to end. I kept the mold, the recipe book, and a few tools worn smooth by time. Now in the quiet of my kitchen, I traced the mold's cool edge with my fingers. The memories were warm, but they carried a shadow, a question that wouldn't leave. Who would care for these things when I was gone? Would they end up in a stranger's cupboard or in the hands of someone who understood their worth? Some days stand out sharper than others. The winter storm of 9/8, roads closed, snow piled high, but yet half the town squeezed into our little shop. Tom brewed extra coffee, and I kept the ovens running until our cheeks burned. We gave out slices of pound cake on paper napkins, the smell of nutmeg wrapping around everyone like a blanket. Then there was the soldier returning from overseas. His mother ordered a chocolate torte with raspberry layers. When he walked in, uniform still dusty from travel, she cried before he even reached her. Tom and I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to fuss over the icing, but we both felt the lump in our throats. Each cake told its own story. A young couple saving pennies for their wedding. We shaped sugar roses by hand, knowing they couldn't afford extras. The mayor's retirement party. A lemon chiffon so light, it nearly floated off the stand. These moments stitched themselves into the walls of Carrington's bakery. The mold was always part of it. I can still hear the gentle thud as Tom set it on the counter, the metallic ring when a spoon tapped its rim. It became more than a tool. It was a witness to our lives, to the joy and grief that passed through our doors. Back in my kitchen now, the air feels still heavy with quiet. The counters are bare, save for the box and yesterday's mail. The clock ticks in steady rhythm, a sound far louder than it should be. I run my hand along the edge of the table, feeling every nick and groove left by years of use. Without Tom, mornings have a hollow shape. The radio stays off. There's no need to shout over his singing. Flour jars stand unopened, their glass catching the cold morning light. I pour a cup of tea, the steam rising in slow curls, and sit where we used to plan the day's orders. The mold rests under its linen cover. I hesitate before lifting it, as if removing the cloth might let the past escape. Its surface gleams faintly, a soft echo of all it has seen. I think of Brooke's door closing, the muffled laughter behind it, and a tightening pulls at my chest. What happens to a legacy when the ones you love don't want it? The question hangs in the room, settling into the corners like dust. I set the mold back in the box, my fingers lingering on the lid. Some answers don't come quickly, but I know one thing. This story isn't finished yet. The grocery store was cooler than I expected, a faint chill drifting from the open dairy cases. I'd come for sugar, flour, and butter. Lucy wanted to try her hand at my peach cobbler. Pushing the cart down the baking aisle, I caught the scent of cinnamon from somewhere nearby. Then I heard her laugh. Light, practiced, the kind you use at luncheons when the cameras are rolling. Brooke stood halfway down the aisle, a sleek black bag looped over her wrist. Beside her was a tall woman in a coral dress, holding a jar of imported honey. I kept my head down, reaching for a bag of flour. Their voices carried over the rustle of packaging. She's stuck in the past, Brooke said, her tone dipped in sugar. Still clings to that old bakery story like it's worth something. The words landed before I could shield myself. I stayed very still, the paper bag's edge pressing into my palm. In the corner of my eye, I saw Brooke adjust her sunglasses, as if the fluorescent lights were too much for her. Her friend murmured something I couldn't catch. Brooke's reply floated back clear as glass. Some people can't move on, it's sad really. I turned a box of baking soda in my hands, reading ingredients I knew by heart. Inside, something hot started to coil. A slow burn that reached the back of my neck. The aisle seemed narrower, the hum of the refrigerator units louder. I thought of the mornings in the bakery, the sound of Tom's laugh, the faces of people who trusted me with their celebrations. Clinging to the past, no, guarding it. Brooke shifted her cart, and our eyes met for a fraction of a second. Her smile was thin, a polite mask with nothing behind it. She didn't stop, didn't greet me, just let the wheels roll her toward the register. I stood there a moment longer, listening to the muffled wheels on tile fade. The flour felt heavier in my grip. I set it gently in the cart, then added the sugar, each bag landing with a muted thud. The checkout lines were short. I chose one far from where Brooke stood. Even so, I could see her reflection in the mirrored panel above the cigarettes. She tossed her hair, leaning toward her friend as if sharing another confidante's truth. I paid, took my receipt, and stepped into the bright parking lot. The sunlight was sharp, bouncing off car windshields and warming the asphalt. Lucy's cobbler would still be made, but the sweetness of the plan had already soured. The road home stretched out in front of me, a ribbon of gray under the afternoon sun. I kept the windows cracked, letting the warm air push through the car. Still, the grocery bags in the passenger seat seemed to hum with the echo of Brooke's voice. Stuck in the past. The phrase repeated itself, like a loose shutter banging in the wind. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. The leather felt smooth, almost slippery under my palms. It wasn't the first time. 2 months ago at a family dinner, Daniel had glanced at my apron and joked to a friend, "She's the historian of carbs." Everyone laughed, but he didn't meet my eyes. Then there was the Thanksgiving where Brooke slid the rolls to the far end of the table, telling her mother, they're her classic recipe. Dense but traditional. I'd smiled, though the words had landed heavier than the bread itself. The mountains came into view, their blue edges softened by a thin haze. I slowed on the curves, passing clusters of dogwood in bloom. Their pale petals stirred in the breeze, delicate yet rooted. By the time I turned onto my street, the shadows had lengthened. My house sat quiet, its porch bathed in late light. I carried the bags inside, the screen door snapping shut behind me. The kitchen was cooler than outside. I set the sugar and flour on the counter, running my fingers over the paper sacks. The silence pressed close, broken only by the faint tick of the clock. I poured a glass of water, the sound crisp in the stillness. Brooke's words still floated at the edges of my thoughts, but something in me had shifted. They no longer stung in the same way. Instead, they took on a shape. A marker I could place, a line she'd drawn without realizing. I remembered Tom's advice when a supplier once tried to shortchange us. "Don't slam the door right away," he'd said. "Stand back. Watch. People tell you exactly who they are if you let them talk long enough." I sipped the water, letting the cool slide down my throat. Maybe that was what I needed to do now. Not defend myself at every turn, not hand over pieces of my story to someone who saw no value in it. Outside, a car passed slowly, its tires crunching over gravel. I stood by the window, watching the taillights fade. There was a calm in observing, in letting the picture come into focus, before deciding the next move. The flour stayed on the counter, waiting for Lucy's visit. For now, I was content to keep my hands clean and my eyes open. The call came just after breakfast. The phone's ring cut through the quiet, a bright, insistent tone in the still kitchen. I was sitting at the table, a second cup of coffee cooling beside me. The morning sun slanted through the blinds, casting narrow stripes across the wood. "Hey, Mom," Daniel said, his voice warm, but a little too quick. "Do you have a minute?" I cradled the phone against my ear. "What's going on?" He cleared his throat, and Brooke's been swamped with wedding plans. "And there's this venue deposit we need to secure." A pause, then a careful addition. "It's time sensitive. If we don't lock it in this week, we might lose the date." I traced the rim of my mug, feeling the cool ceramic under my fingertips. "That sounds important," I said slowly. "What do you need from me?" Daniel exhaled, as though relieved to have reached this point. "Well, it'd be easier if you could just sign a quick authorization form. It would let me handle the transfer directly from your account. Save us the trouble of back and forth." The handle of the mug felt heavier in my hand. "My account?" I repeated. "I thought you'd been saving for the wedding." "We have," he said quickly, "but with all the extra costs, flowers, photographer, Brooke's dress, things add up fast." "It's not a loan, Mom. We'll replace it as soon as the honeymoon's over." The blinds clicked softly as a breeze pushed against the window. I stared at the sunlight striping the table, thinking of the years I'd worked to build that fund. Every deposit was a safety net, a quiet assurance I could live on my terms. Daniel kept talking. "You wouldn't have to do anything else. Just sign and I'll take care of the rest. It's really just a formality." I pictured Brooke's polished smile at the brunch, the way she'd turned before I could speak. The idea of her hands, anyone's hands, on that account sent a slow ripple of unease through me. "I'll need to read whatever you're asking me to sign," I said finally. "Of course," Daniel replied too quickly again. I can bring it by tonight. You'll see it's simple. No strings. No strings. The phrase sat wrong in my chest. I watched a dust mote drift through the sunlight, turning lazily in the air before disappearing into shadow. Tonight then, I said. My voice was steady, but inside, something had shifted. The same tightening I'd felt in the grocery aisle, the same quiet flare of caution. We said our goodbyes. The line clicked dead. I sat at the table a while longer, the coffee now cold, the blinds swaying gently, as if the house itself had heard every word. By evening, the light outside had turned amber. Shadows from the maple trees stretched across the porch. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel before Daniel appeared at the door. He held a slim manila folder in one hand, a takeout bag in the other. Brought dinner? He said, lifting the bag like a peace offering. The smell of fried chicken and rosemary biscuits drifted into the hall. I stepped aside to let him in. We sat at the kitchen table, paper cartons spread between us. The blinds were half closed, slivers of fading sunlight striping the walls. Daniel made small talk while we ate, but his eyes kept sliding toward the folder. When the plates were pushed aside, he reached for it. Figured we could get this out of the way, he said. He slid the papers across to me, the smooth manila cool under my fingers. The first page looked official enough. Dense paragraphs, blocks of fine print. But the heading made my chest tighten of durable power of attorney financial. Not just a single transfer, it would give him unrestricted access to my accounts. I ran a finger down the margin, feeling the faint ridge of the stapled corner. The scent of chicken grease hung in the air, heavy, almost cloying. This isn't just for the venue, I said quietly. Daniel shifted in his chair. It's the easiest way, Mom. One signature, and I can handle things without bothering you. He tried to smile, but it didn't touch his eyes. I looked at the lines waiting for my name, imagining them filled in, imagining the numbers in my account shrinking without a word from me. You know I'd need to have someone look this over, I said. The words came out calm, though I felt my pulse in my throat. He sighed, leaning back as if I'd made a small inconvenience. Lawyers will drag it out. We might lose the booking. I'm trying to make this easier. Easier for who? The question stayed in my head. I turned another page, scanning the clauses. The legal language was thick, but the meaning was plain enough. I'd be handing over the keys to everything I'd saved. I'm not signing tonight, I said. I'll read it carefully. We'll talk after. He pressed his lips together, then stood, sliding the folder back toward himself. All right, but don't wait too long. At the door, he hugged me quickly. His jacket smelled faintly of cologne and city air. When he stepped into the darkening yard, the porch light caught on the folder under his arm. I watched until his car's taillights slipped out of view. Back inside, the kitchen felt cooler. I stacked the empty cartons, the sound of cardboard folding sharp in the quiet. Every nerve in me was alert now. The kind of quiet readiness Tom used to have before negotiating with a supplier. Something told me this was only the beginning. The days after Daniel's visit stretched long and thin. Phone calls dwindled to short check-ins, each one edged with polite distance. Brooke didn't call at all. When I did hear her voice, it was in the background. A faint note behind Daniel's words, never meant for me. The house was quiet most afternoons. Sunlight slid across the living room rug, then disappeared, leaving the corners in shadow. I kept busy with small things, washing the same set of dishes, folding tea towels that didn't need folding, but the silence pressed closer each day. One Thursday, a knock broke the stillness. I opened the door to find Lucy balancing a covered plate in one hand and a thermos in the other. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold air. Thought you might like a taste test, she said. She stepped inside, bringing with her the scent of cinnamon and apples. The smell wrapped around me before I'd even closed the door. We settled at the kitchen table. Lucy pulled back the dish towel to reveal hand pies, their crusts golden and flaky. Steam curled from the split edges. They're not as pretty as yours, she said, sliding one toward me. But I'm working on it. The first bite was warm and sweet, the apples soft but not mushy. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the cinnamon bloom on my tongue. Better than mine some days, I said, and meant it. She grinned, then poured tea from the thermos. The mug warmed my hands instantly. Outside, bare branches rattled against the windows. Inside, the tea's steam fogged the glass. Lucy chatted about her week. The community garden's winter cleanup, a stray cat that had started hanging around her porch. Her voice filled the kitchen in a way I hadn't realized I needed. I watched the way her eyes lit when she talked about learning to bake. She asked about my crust recipe, scribbling notes on a folded grocery list. Her handwriting tilted uphill, each word pressed into the paper like she meant to keep it forever. When she finally stood to leave, she left the plate half full. "Save some for later," she said. Her scarf smelled faintly of wood smoke when we hugged at the door. After she left, I carried the pies to the counter. The kitchen still held the heat from the oven, though mine had been cold all day. For the first time in weeks, I felt the edges of the house soften, as if someone else's warmth had settled into its walls. After Lucy left, the house settled into stillness again. The scent of cinnamon lingered in the air, mixing with the faint aroma of brewed tea. I rinsed our mugs, the warm water running over my fingers before disappearing down the drain. The light outside was shifting to blue. I carried what was left of the pies to the kitchen counter, covering them loosely with foil. Then I moved to the front window, resting one hand on the sill. The glass was cool beneath my palm. Across the street, porch lights flickered on one by one. I could see shadows moving inside the Miller house. The shape of a man lifting a child into his arms, the flash of a dog's tail. Somewhere down the block, a screen door slammed, followed by the crunch of hurried footsteps on gravel. I stayed there for a while, listening to the layered sounds of early evening. A car door shutting, the low hum of an engine idling, the faint laughter of someone walking past, their voice trailing away before I could catch the words. My own phone sat silent on the counter. No missed calls, no messages. Daniel used to ring in the evenings. Short calls, but enough to remind me I was still in his orbit. Now, even that small tether had loosened. I thought about Lucy's scarf, the smell of wood smoke clinging to its fibers. Her visit had left a warmth in the room that felt different from the polite exchanges I'd had with family lately. There had been no performance, no carefully measured words, just an honest presence, a plate of imperfect pies, and an eagerness to listen. The contrast sat heavy in my chest. I remembered the last time Brooke had been in this house, her eyes scanning the furniture like she was taking inventory, her smile polite but absent. She'd stood near the doorway the entire visit, never setting down her purse. A gust of wind rattled the branches outside. The sky was darker now. Streetlights buzzing to life along the curb. Their glow pooled in uneven circles on the pavement. I turned away from the window, the living room shadows stretching long toward the hallway. In the kitchen, the foil over the pies caught the light, its surface rippling faintly with each draft from the vents. The quiet was still here, but it felt different, less like a void, more like a pause between heartbeats. Lucy had reminded me that kindness could arrive unannounced, carried in by someone who wanted nothing in return. It didn't erase the distance growing between me and Daniel, but it carved out a small space inside me where hope could sit without being chased away. I switched off the porch light, the click loud in the dark. Upstairs, the bed would be cool, the air still carrying that trace of cinnamon. I'd fall asleep with it in my lungs, and maybe dream of a kitchen that felt full again. The invitation came in a short text from Daniel. "Brunch at the Willow House Sunday at 11. Family thing, hope you can make it." No mention of what it was for. Still, I ironed a navy blouse, polished my shoes, and tucked my hair behind my ears the way Tom used to like. The morning air was crisp when I pulled into the gravel lot. Sunlight caught on the white clapboard of the restaurant, its porch lined with baskets of early spring flowers. Inside, the scent of coffee and baked ham mingled with something floral. A hostess led me through a maze of linen-covered tables. Laughter and the clink of cutlery floated over the hum of conversation. I spotted Daniel near the far wall, standing beside Brooke in a cream dress that fit like it was sewn onto her. Brooke's smile was wide when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Hi, Helen," she said, touching my arm briefly before turning back to a woman beside her. "This is my mother, Claire." She didn't add anything else. Daniel gestured toward a table in the corner. "Your seat's over there, Mom. We're just getting started." I followed his hand and saw it. A small table for four, already half filled by an elderly couple I didn't recognize. They were deep in conversation, their heads bent together over their plates. From this corner, the main table, long, bright, set for a dozen, was a world away. I sat down quietly. The chair wobbled slightly on the uneven floor. From here, I could see Brooke laughing with her mother, Daniel pouring mimosas, the sunlight glinting off glassware. No one looked my way. The couple beside me spoke in low tones about a vacation in Florida. I nodded politely when they glanced up, but their attention slid back to each other. A waiter brought a plate. Squishy. Fruit, a small croissant. The pastry was cold by the time I took a bite. From across the room, I caught bits of toasts and introductions. Brooke's voice carried, warm and clear. And of course, my mother has been my rock. More laughter, the gentle tap of a spoon against a glass. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, letting the heat seep into my palms. The murmur of the main table rose and fell like a tide, pulling me in just far enough to hear my name mentioned once, then letting it drift away again. A photographer moved between tables, snapping candid shots. When he reached mine, he took a quick frame without asking, then moved on before I could adjust my expression. I imagined the photo later. Me in the corner, half in shadow, a prop in someone else's backdrop. The air in the room felt heavier with each passing minute. I sipped slowly, watching a bead of condensation slide down the water glass. It left a faint trail on the linen when I set it back down. From the main table, Daniel glanced toward me once, offered a quick smile, then turned to refill Brooke's glass. The sound of their conversation didn't carry this far. I folded my napkin in half, then again, its edges no longer crisp. The urge to leave pressed against my ribs, but I stayed, my chair anchored in place by something heavier than politeness. A clinking of glassware drew my eyes to the main table. Brooke stood, her cream dress catching the light, a mimosa in hand. The room's chatter softened. "I just want to thank everyone here," she began, her voice warm and practiced, "and for being part of our journey, and for welcoming my family so fully." She turned to her right, gesturing toward her mother. "My rock, my guide, the woman who taught me what family means." Applause rippled down the table. Her mother beamed. I waited, fingers curled around my coffee cup, but Brooke's gaze drifted past me as if I were another chair against the wall. No mention, no glance in my direction. A man I didn't know approached my table, smiling politely. "And how do you know the happy couple?" I opened my mouth, but Brooke, passing behind him, answered for me. "She's Daniel's mom. She's more into her old bakery days than all this wedding fuss." Her laugh was light, but it landed like a slap. The man gave a tight nod and moved away. I set my cup down carefully, the porcelain clicking softly against the saucer. The couple beside me kept talking about Florida, oblivious to the heat rising in my face. Across the room, Daniel poured champagne, his back to me. The photographer circled again. This time he paused at Brooke's side, snapping a shot of her and Claire clinking glasses. He didn't look my way. A server came by with a tray of Petit Fours. "Would you like one?" I chose a lemon square, its powdered sugar dusting my fingertips. It was tart and sweet, but hard to swallow with the knot in my throat. Brooke's laughter floated over the room. I glanced at the exit, the sunlight spilling across the foyer's hardwood floor. Leaving now would mean walking past every table, through the smiles and sideways glances. I stayed seated, letting the minutes drip by. When the plates were cleared, Brooke rose again. "One last toast," she said. "To family, old and new. May we always be surrounded by love." She raised her glass high, glasses lifted around the main table. Mine stayed on the saucer. The clapping was polite, but inside me something settled. Not resignation exactly. I'm more like a stone placed in the center of still water. The ripples would come later. As people began to stand and hug, I eased my chair back. No one stopped me. The hostess smiled as I passed, the scent of fresh coffee and baked ham fading with each step toward the door. Outside, the sunlight felt sharper. I breathed in the cool air, its clarity cutting through the heaviness in my chest. From the porch, I could still hear the muffled rise of voices inside, a bubble I'd never been invited to enter. "Folks, have you ever been present in a room, yet treated as if you weren't there? Would you have spoken up or simply walked away? Share your thoughts. I'm curious how you'd have handled it." Rain had been falling since morning, a steady patter against the kitchen windows. I was slicing apples for a pie when a knock sounded at the back door. Lucy stepped in, shaking droplets from her jacket, her cheeks pink from the damp air. "I brought you something to see," she said, setting her phone on the table. The scent of wet earth clung to her scarf. She pulled it loose, perching on the chair across from me. On the screen was a photo, a Brooke standing in front of a chalkboard sign that read "Coming Soon, Magnolia and Thyme Bakery." Her smile was wide, her hair swept over one shoulder. In her hands, she cradled something silver. Even blurred by the camera flash, I knew every curve, every polished edge. The wedding cake mold. My breath caught, and the paring knife stilled against the cutting board. Lucy glanced up. "Isn't that yours?" The kitchen felt smaller, the hum of the refrigerator louder. I leaned closer to the screen. Brooke had written beneath the photo, "Can't wait to give this gorgeous antique a new life as our centerpiece." At the word antique seemed to press down on me, heavier than it should. This wasn't a vase from a flea market. It was the mold Tom and I had guarded for decades, through moves, storms, and years of work. I could almost feel its cool weight in my hands, the faint groove where our initials were carved. I forced my voice steady. "Where did she post this?" "Her public page," Lucy said. She tagged the bakery account, said they're doing a soft opening in the summer. The apples on the cutting board were starting to brown at the edges. I pushed them aside, my palms leaving faint damp marks on the wood. "She didn't ask me," I said quietly. The words sounded strange, as if I were hearing them from someone else's mouth. Lucy frowned. "I figured she might have borrowed it. I mean, maybe Daniel?" "No," I cut in. My tone surprised us both. "That mold never left my house." The rainwater tapped harder against the glass like impatient fingers. I sat back, the chair's wooden edge pressing into my spine. In my mind, I saw the mold in its box, tucked under linen on the pantry shelf. Safe until now. "Lucy studied my face. You think she's planning to take it?" "I think," I said slowly. "She's already decided it's hers." Silence settled between us, broken only by the rhythmic drip from the eaves outside. I reached for a paper towel, wiping my damp hands even though they were already dry. The photo on Lucy's phone seemed to glow against the dim kitchen light, a bright, sharp reminder. I should get these apples in the fridge. I murmured, but neither of us moved. My thoughts were already pulling away from the table, turning over possibilities, cataloging every detail of that photo. The background, the caption, the way she held the mold like a trophy. When Lucy left, the rain had eased to a mist. I stood at the window long after her car pulled away, watching water trail down the glass in thin, uneven lines. Each drop slid lower, leaving a clear path behind. The moment the door closed behind Lucy, I moved toward the pantry. The light in the hallway was dim, casting long shadows across the floor. My slippers made no sound on the worn rug. I reached the pantry door and felt the familiar brass knob turn under my hand. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with cloves. I stepped past jars of preserves and tins of cocoa until I reached the linen-covered box on the top shelf. My fingers slipped under the fabric. The silver was cold against my skin, the weight unmistakable. I lifted the mold out, holding it so the kitchen light caught along its edges. Every curve, every engraving was just as it had been. Relief loosened something in my chest, but it didn't last. I set it on the counter, running a thumb over the groove where Tom had carved our initials. The metal seemed to hold the memory of his hands. The idea of Brooke displaying it like some decorative prize made my stomach tighten. I wiped the mold with a soft cloth, then wrapped it again in linen. This time, I placed it at the back of the shelf, behind a row of heavy canisters. The shift of weight made the wood creak. Leaning on the counter, I let my thoughts circle back. A Brooke in that photo, her fingers curled possessively around the handle, Daniel smiling in the background. Had he taken the picture? Had he stood there while she claimed it as hers? I replayed their last visit. Brooke had wandered into the kitchen, complimenting the rustic charm of the shelves. She'd opened the pantry door without asking, laughing about how organized I was. At the time, I'd brushed it off. Now, I saw it differently. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. I poured a glass of water, the cold sliding down my throat while my mind worked through possibilities. Keeping the mold here suddenly felt like an invitation. Too easy to find, too easy to take. I thought about the cedar chest upstairs, its key still on my dresser. It was heavy, lined with quilted fabric Tom's mother had sewn. If the mold stayed there, it would be safe from casual hands. I carried the box upstairs, the wood pressing into my forearms. In my bedroom, the late afternoon light slanted across the floorboards. I opened the chest and laid the mold inside, nestled between folded blankets. The lid closed with a low, solid sound. Standing there, I felt the quiet stretch out. It wasn't just about the mold anymore. It was about the habit of taking small things, big things, each one justified by someone else's version of what's fair. I locked the chest and set the key in the back of my jewelry box. The clink it made against the other keys was soft but certain. Downstairs, the kitchen felt different, emptier but not vulnerable. I straightened the pantry shelves, wiping away an invisible film of dust. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed, followed by the murmur of voices. I stood still, listening until the sound faded. Then I returned to the table, the mold now hidden, and began slicing fresh apples. Each cut was steady, the rhythm slow and deliberate. If Brooke wanted it, she would have to find more than a key. She'd have to get past me. The house was silent except for the wind. It hissed through the oak branches outside, scraping them against the siding in uneven strokes. I lay on my back, the ceiling just a darker shade of black in the night. Sleep wouldn't come. Each time I closed my eyes, the image of Brooke with the mold returned. Her fingers around it, her smile like she'd already won something. I turned onto my side, the sheet cool against my legs. Somewhere in the quiet, I heard Tom's voice the way it had been on long drives back from the market. You guard what matters, Helen. Not just for yourself, but for the hands you trust it to next. Back then, we'd meant recipes, equipment, the bakery itself. Now, the words felt heavier. I reached for the glass of water on the nightstand. It was still half full, cool when it touched my lips. The clock beside it glowed 2017. I could almost hear the seconds ticking past, each one like a drip from a slow faucet. I began turning over what I knew. Rookwood's bakery announcement, Daniel's silence, the timing of that brunch. None of it was random. They were moving pieces into place. Assuming I'd stay still, I swung my legs out of bed and pulled on the sweater hanging over the chair. Down the hall, the floor creaked under my bare feet. I paused at the top of the stairs, listening for any sound from outside. Only the wind answered. In the kitchen, I switched on the small lamp over the sink. Its yellow glow pooled on the counter, leaving the corners in shadow. The cedar chest key was still tucked upstairs, but I knew exactly where it was. Knowing it was there felt like a line drawn, me on one side, them on the other. I sat at the table, hands wrapped around the mug I'd left from earlier. The ceramic was cold now, but it grounded me. I began sketching thoughts in my head, what to move, what to lock, who to talk to at the bank. Each step was small, but together they began to feel like armor. The wind picked up, rattling the vent cover above the stove. I thought about Lucy, about the way she had looked at me when she showed me that photo. She hadn't said the words, but I'd seen the warning in her eyes. Maybe she could help, quietly. Maybe she already was. By the time I went back upstairs, the clock read 30:02. I slid under the covers, still wide awake, but calmer. The plan wasn't finished, but it had started to take shape. I would move at my own pace, and I wouldn't wait for anyone to tell me when. The morning light was pale and thin, spreading across the kitchen floor in long rectangles. I stood at the counter, hands wrapped around a fresh mug of coffee. Steam curled toward my face, carrying the bitter scent that always steadied me. Sleep had been shallow, but my mind was sharp. I carried the cedar chest key in my pocket, its edges pressing against the fabric each time I moved. It was a reminder, small, solid, and mine. After breakfast, I cleared the table and set out a stack of folders. Some were dusty from the back of the cabinet. The paper inside smelled faintly of old ink and manila. Bank statements, property deeds, insurance forms. Each one a thread in the net I was about to tighten. I started with the bank accounts. Sitting at the desk in the corner, I opened my laptop and logged in. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock filled the quiet while the page loaded. Every transaction for the last 6 months scrolled before me. Nothing obvious, but I knew better than to wait for obvious. I called the bank's direct line. The hold music was soft piano, broken now and then by a polite voice reminding me my call was important. When the manager came on, I asked about joint access, who had it, and how to remove it. We spoke in clip, careful phrases. By the time I hung up, the accounts were flagged for any changes and passwords reset. Next came the deed to my house. The paper was thick, edges slightly curled from years in its folder. Tom's signature sat beside mine, the ink faded but unbroken. I slipped it into a plastic sleeve, then placed it in the lockbox I kept at the very back of my bedroom closet. I worked methodically, moving between the desk and the file cabinet. Some documents I scanned, the software of the machine blending with the sound of birds outside. Others I sealed in envelopes and marked for the safe deposit box downtown. By mid-morning, the dining table was covered in neat stacks. Legal papers on one side, personal letters and recipes on the other. The mold's location stayed between me and the cedar chest, but I wrote a short note in Tom's old ledger's autumn moved for safekeeping January. No details. Just enough to remind myself later. I paused at the window, looking out over the bare trees and quiet street. Somewhere down the block, a delivery truck rumbled past. It struck me how ordinary the day looked, the kind of morning where nothing seemed to be happening. Yet here I was, redrawing the lines of my life in pen. Before putting the folders away, I slipped a smaller envelope into my handbag. Inside was a copy of my will. I'd be taking it to the attorney next week, making changes that would close certain doors for good. When the last drawer shut, I exhaled slowly. The house felt different, lighter but also fortified. I rinsed my coffee cup, watching the water swirl and disappear. The quiet was no longer a weight. It was a shield I'd built with my own hands. The first step was to change the rhythm of my days. I kept my usual routines. A morning coffee at the kitchen table, short walks to the market, phone calls to Lucy. But beneath them, I began moving pieces they couldn't see. One Thursday, I sat at the desk in the back room, sunlight sliding in through the blinds in narrow bands. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish from the shelves I'd dusted earlier. I opened my checkbook and ran my finger down the ledger. For years, I'd been covering Daniel's car insurance, quietly paying his credit card balance when it slipped too high. It was time to let those bills find their way back to him. I called the insurance office first. The woman on the line asked if I was sure. Yes, I said, keeping my voice even. Please remove my payment information effective next month. She confirmed it, and the quiet click of her keyboard felt like a page turning. Next came the automatic transfers. The bank's online form was quick. A few lines deleted, a final confirmation box. When it was done, my account looked leaner, but the numbers felt more mine than they had in years. The changes were small enough to pass unnoticed at first. If Daniel asked, I'd have a ready excuse. Rising costs, tightening the budget, anything to make it sound temporary. In truth, there was nothing temporary about it. By mid-afternoon, I was downtown, the chill wind carrying the scent of roasted coffee from the cafe on the corner. I stopped at the credit union where Lucy kept her account. We'd never talked about money, but I knew the hours she picked up at the diner barely covered her rent and groceries. Inside, the lobby was warm, humming softly with the sound of the heater. I filled out a slip for a one-time deposit. The teller didn't ask questions, just counted the bills, stamped the paper, and slid it back to me with a polite nod. Walking home, I kept my coat collar turned up against the wind. The envelope of receipts in my bag felt heavier than its weight. These were not grand gestures, no public gifts or announcements. But they were deliberate. I was shifting the ground inch by inch. That evening, I wrote a list in my ledger. At the top, I protect, redirect, preserve. I under, protect. I noted the mold, the deed, and my will updates. Under redirect, I added Lucy the church pantry, and the scholarship fund Tom and I had once talked about restarting. Under preserve, I left space for the things I hadn't yet thought of, but knew I would. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the mantel clock. I let my pen rest on the page, feeling the stillness wrap around me. This was not revenge in the loud, satisfying way people imagined. It was slower, calmer, like water wearing away stone. In the next few weeks, I'd keep smiling at Sunday dinners, nodding through conversations I'd already stopped believing. But behind those smiles, I'd be pulling threads until the whole fabric shifted in my hands. The following Tuesday, I sat in the corner office of my attorney, the smell of leather, bound books, and fresh coffee in the air. Morning light spilled across the polished desk, catching the edge of a brass letter opener. Mr. Franklin adjusted his glasses, reviewing the pages I'd signed. "These changes are clear," he said. "No ambiguity. Everything goes to the beneficiaries you've listed. No room for challenge." He glanced up, as if to be sure I understood the weight of that sentence. I did. We talked about the safe deposit box downtown. He suggested I store both the updated will and the deed there, along with an inventory of valuable items. I pictured the cedar chest upstairs, its key hidden deep in my jewelry box, and nodded. "I'll prepare the list tonight." From there, I walked 3 blocks to a smaller bank, one Daniel and Brooke didn't know I used. The lobby smelled faintly of pine cleaner, and a pot of chrysanthemums brightened the front desk. I opened a new savings account, transferring a portion of my funds into it. The young teller smiled as she handed me the paperwork, unaware of the relief her simple act gave me. Outside, the wind had shifted warmer. I stopped at the florist, buying a small bouquet for Lucy's break room at the diner. When I dropped it off, she laughed. "Feels like spring in here now," she said, tucking the blooms into a tall glass. I didn't mention the deposit I'd made into her account the week before. That evening, I spread my ledger on the kitchen table. The columns under Protect and of Redirect were filling steadily. Under Preserve, I added Community Center Kitchen Fund. And scholarship for local culinary students. Tom would have liked that. His way of giving back through the craft we'd built together. The kettle whistled softly, and I poured hot water into my favorite chipped mug. Chamomile rose in gentle steam, the scent calming but not dulling my thoughts. This wasn't a battle fought in bursts, it was a steady reclamation. Each signature, each quiet transfer was a small hinge turning the door toward my own side. I thought about the brunch, about Brooke's toast that had skipped my name and Daniel's easy smile that had slid past me. That version of me, the one in the corner waiting for acknowledgement, was already gone. The person sitting here now was writing her own list of who would stand in the circle. The mantel clock chimed 8. I closed the ledger, sliding it into the drawer with a final, solid push. The house felt warmer not from the heat, but from the sense that every wall now stood on my terms. Tell me, if you had the chance to quietly reshape the future, would you do it piece by piece in the shadows, or would you lay it all bare at once? I'd like to know which path you'd choose and why. The afternoon light was low and gold, slanting through the lace curtains in narrow stripes. I had set the kitchen table with 3 mugs, each filled halfway with coffee that would cool quickly if left untouched. The scent of cinnamon rolls hung in the air, sweet enough to soften the edges of the moment I'd planned. At exactly 4, I heard tires on the gravel drive. Through the window, Daniel's truck came into view, Brooke's red scarf bright against the gray interior. They stepped out together, their voices muffled, the rhythm of their footsteps in sync. When I opened the door, I kept my smile small. "Thanks for coming," I said. I thought it was time we went over some papers. Brooke's eyes darted past me into the house. Daniel's hands were in his jacket pockets, shoulders slightly hunched. They followed me to the kitchen, the old floorboards creaking under our weight. "Coffee?" I offered, gesturing to the table. Brooke sat first, her perfume faint and sharp, cutting through the warm scent of cinnamon. Daniel lowered himself into the chair beside her, glancing at the manila envelope on the table. I took the seat across from them, resting my hands on the envelope. "This," I began, "is just some housekeeping, making sure everything's clear for the future." Brooke leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the flap of the envelope. "What kind of housekeeping?" Her tone was casual, but her fingers tapped lightly against the mug. I let the question hang for a moment. The ticking of the mantel clock in the next room sounded louder than usual. Then I slid the envelope closer to me, not opening it yet. "Papers about the house, some banking matters, a few personal items," I said. "I wanted you both to hear it from me, so there's no confusion later." Daniel's eyes met mine for the first time. Something in them shifted, a quick flash of caution. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "No," I said evenly. "But I've learned it's better to be clear than to let others guess at your intentions." Brooke's smile tightened. "That's thoughtful." The words landed like a pebble on ice, a small sound but with cracks beneath it. I sipped my coffee, letting the heat linger on my tongue. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the porch rail. In here, the stillness was almost solid. I reached for the envelope again, this time placing it in the center of the table. "We'll get to the details," I said, my voice steady. "But first, I want to talk about what matters most to me and why I've made certain decisions." Their eyes followed my hands, but neither reached for the envelope. It was enough for now that they'd heard the word. Decisions. Enough to make them wonder what exactly they were about to learn. I let my fingertips rest on the envelope, the paper cool under my skin. "When your father was alive," I began, "we kept everything in order. Bank accounts, deeds, business records. I've decided it's time to put that order back." Daniel shifted in his chair, the wood groaning faintly. Brooke's gaze sharpened. "Meaning what exactly?" she asked. I opened the envelope and drew out a neat stack of documents. The faint smell of ink and paper rose as I placed them in a line. "These?" I said. "Her confirmations, updates to my account's insurance, and my will." Brooke's hand froze halfway to her mug. Daniel leaned forward, eyes scanning the headers on the top page. "You changed your will?" he said. "Yes," I replied. "My assets will go where they're most valued. I've made sure they're protected from anyone who might see them as negotiable." Brooke's lips parted, but she didn't speak right away. The clock in the living room struck 4:30, its chime echoing down the hall. I waited until the sound faded. "I've also closed certain accounts," I continued, "and moved the funds into places you don't have access to. This house, I tapped the deed with one finger. Is in my name alone, and it will stay that way. Daniel's brow tightened. Mom, you never asked. I cut in softly, but you assumed. There's a difference. The silence that followed was thick. Even the faint ticking of the clock seemed slower. Brooke broke it first. I just don't understand why you'd make these decisions now. I folded my hands in my lap. Because I've learned that waiting until someone else acts is the surest way to lose what matters. This isn't sudden, Brooke. It's careful. Her nails tapped against the ceramic mug, a quick, restless rhythm. Daniel's eyes flicked to her, then back to me. I could see the calculation there. How much he wanted to push, how much he feared knowing more. I'm not shutting anyone out, I said quietly. But I am drawing lines. Where those lines are crossed, I'll take action. And I won't apologize for it. Brooke finally leaned back, the chair legs creaking against the floor. Daniel sat still, but his jaw worked as if he were chewing on words he wouldn't say. I let them sit in that space, feeling the weight shift in the room. It wasn't victory yet, but it was the ground tilting under their feet. I reached into the envelope one last time and slid out a smaller, glossy photograph. It was warm from the papers it had been pressed between. I placed it in the center of the table, turning it so they could see. The picture showed the silver wedding cake mold, wrapped in linen, resting inside the cedar chest. The light in the photo caught the engraved initials, casting a soft gleam across the curve of the metal. It looked untouched, untouchable. Brooke's eyes narrowed. Why are you showing us this? She asked, her voice low. Because, I said, this is the one thing you seemed most eager to take. I wanted you to know it's already where it belongs, and it's not here for you to find. Daniel leaned closer, his thumb brushing the edge of the photo. You're saying it's locked away? I'm saying it's beyond your reach, I replied. It's part of my will now. It will go to someone who understands what it's worth beyond the silver. Brooke gave a short, brittle laugh. It's just a mold. I met her gaze. No, it's the history of every celebration this family has ever had. It's my wedding day. It's your father's steady hands. It's the proof that not everything can be bought or claimed just because you've decided it should be. The air in the kitchen seemed heavier. Daniel sat back, his eyes avoiding mine now. Brooke shifted in her chair, crossing her arms. I thought you should both hear it from me, I continued. There will be no arguments later, no stories told in your favor. Everything is documented. Everything is in place. A photograph lay between us, a quiet line neither of them dared cross. I sipped my coffee, now lukewarm, and let the silence grow. The mantel clock struck 5, its chimes marking the close of this conversation. Finally, I stood and gathered the papers into the envelope, sliding the photograph back on top. You can finish your coffee or not, I said. But we're done here? Daniel rose slowly. Brooke didn't move until he stepped toward the door. I walked with him to the entryway, the wood floor cool beneath my slippers. At the threshold, I stopped. From now on, I said, you'll know exactly where you stand and where you don't. Neither replied. They stepped out into the fading light, the sound of gravel crunching under their shoes. When the door shut behind them, the house felt still, but not empty. It felt mine again. The house settled into a different kind of quiet after they left. It wasn't the heavy stillness of waiting. It was lighter, like air after a storm. I woke each morning without glancing at my phone, no longer expecting a message from Daniel about a bill to cover or an urgent favor. By the third day, their absence felt almost ordinary. No calls, no knocks on the door. Even the mail was quieter. Just my subscription to the local paper and the grocery flyer tucked into the box. I let it sit on the counter until I felt like reading it. Lucy stopped by on Thursday afternoon. I saw her car in the drive and opened the door before she could knock. She carried a paper bag that smelled of cinnamon and butter. Your favorite scones, she said, stepping inside. The warmth of the kitchen wrapped around us as I set the kettle to boil. We sat at the table, steam rising from our mugs of tea. She didn't ask about Daniel or Brooke, and I didn't bring them up. Instead, we talked about the bakery she wanted to open someday, how she'd already been testing recipes in her tiny apartment oven. Her laughter filled the space in a way it hadn't been filled in months. Later, after she left, I walked through the rooms of my house. Sunlight poured through the west-facing windows, painting gold squares on the hardwood. The cedar chest upstairs stayed locked, its key resting in the same hidden place. I touched the top of it once, just to feel the solid weight under my palm. Meals were simpler now. The oatmeal in the morning, a bowl of vegetable soup for dinner. I found myself cooking for flavor, not for an audience. Without the pressure to please anyone but myself, I lingered over the smell of onions caramelizing, the hiss of butter in the pan. At night, I read by the light of the lamp in the living room. Sometimes I paused mid-page, listening to the creak of the house as it settled into the cold. There was no edge of dread in that quiet anymore. It felt like the walls were holding me instead of pressing in. One afternoon, I took a walk to the park at the end of the street. The air was crisp, smelling faintly of pine from the evergreens along the path. I sat on a bench, watching children race each other down the hill. For the first time in a long while, I thought about the future without feeling cornered. I still kept my guard. Locks were checked twice at night, documents stayed in order, and the new bank account was monitored weekly. But the vigilance no longer came from fear. It came from ownership. Every choice, every boundary was mine to keep. 2 weeks passed without a single word from Daniel or Brooke. No calls, no letters, not even a message through a neighbor. Their silence was complete. And strangely, it didn't ache the way I once feared it would. It felt more like a door quietly closing behind me. Lucy's visits became the rhythm of my days. Some mornings she'd tap on the back door, her hair still damp from a quick shower, holding a basket of warm muffins. Other times she'd stop by after work, slipping off her shoes at the entryway and settling at the table with a story about a difficult customer or a new dessert she wanted to try. We started baking together on Saturdays. The kitchen would fill with the smell of yeast and sugar, the windows fogging slightly as the oven warmed the room. Flour dusted the countertop, and sometimes the floor, and Lucy would laugh when I brushed it from my sleeves. We spoke easily, without the careful pauses I used to measure around Daniel and Brooke. One afternoon, I took her out to the garden behind the house. The soil was cold under our boots, but we walked the rows anyway, talking about what could be planted come spring. I made a note to order seeds, tomatoes, basil, maybe even sunflowers for the fence line. It was the first plan I'd made in months. That wasn't about protecting something from loss. Inside, I began reorganizing the shelves in the pantry. Jars of homemade jam sat alongside neatly labeled containers of flour and sugar. The order pleased me. It reminded me of the years when the bakery ran smoothly, every tool in its place, every recipe within reach. Now that order belonged to me alone. In the evenings, I tried new recipes. An apple tart with a lattice crust, a savory bread pudding with herbs from the windowsill pots. The scents drifted through the rooms, and I found myself humming while I worked. It was a quiet kind of happiness, but solid. Lucy noticed. "You've got a glow about you lately," she said one night, pouring us each a glass of sweet tea. I smiled but didn't try to explain. Some things didn't need to be put into words. I even allowed myself to think about travel. Not far, just a few days along the coast, maybe to Beaufort or Wilmington, somewhere with sea air and quiet streets. The idea sat in my mind like a small flame, something to tend until it was ready to burn brighter. Through it all, I kept my watchfulness. The documents in the safe deposit box stayed current, the bank account secure, the locks tested twice a day. Caution had become less of a shield and more of a habit, a way of holding what mattered without fear. The house at night was still and warm, lamplight pooling on the pages of my book, the faint tick of the clock steady in the background. I realized I was no longer waiting for the next blow to fall. I was simply living, and for now that was enough. Spring came quietly, folding soft green back into the hills. From my kitchen window, I watched the first buds swell on the dogwood tree, their pale petals opening as if to test the air. The morning smelled of damp earth and new grass, the kind of scent that made you believe in starting over. Lucy and I kept our Saturday baking ritual. Some days we worked side by side in easy silence, the sound of dough thumping softly against the counter. Other days, she'd chatter about her week while I measured flour or stirred custard, our voices weaving into the hum of the oven. I noticed how sure her hands had become. No wasted movements, no hesitation when folding batter. One afternoon, I set a weathered notebook on the table between us. Its cover was worn soft at the corners, pages yellowed and faintly perfumed with vanilla. Lucy looked up from shaping rolls. "What's this?" "The bakery's heart," I said. "Every recipe worth keeping, every story that goes with them." She opened it carefully, running a finger along the margin notes written in my hand. Sometimes there were measurements, other times just phrases. "Serve warm to cure a bad day," or best at the first frost. Ooh, her eyes lit with a kind of reverence I recognized from the first time I held it. It's yours, I added. Not now, but when it's time. Until then, we'll add to it together. The kettle whistled softly on the stove, and I poured us tea. We sat with our mugs, steam curling between us. Outside, a light breeze rattled the daffodils in their pots. Inside, it felt like the kitchen itself was leaning in, holding the moment. I didn't think about Daniel or Brooke much anymore. When I did, it was like remembering a season already past. Sharp in its day, but now only a story I could put back on the shelf. The bitterness had thinned, leaving room for something else to take root. Lucy closed the notebook gently, a small smile settling on her face. "I'll take good care of it," she said. I believed her. That night, I left the notebook on the counter instead of locking it away. The pages caught the lamplight as I passed through the room, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to guard it so closely. Some things, once placed in the right hands, no longer need protecting. By late summer, the scent of fresh paint and rising bread filled a small shop on the corner of Main and Cedar. Lucy had signed the lease in May, and every week since, I'd watched the space transform. Bare walls becoming shelves, an empty counter turning into a glass display ready for the first morning rush. On opening day, the sun broke through early, casting a soft gold over the street. I arrived before the ribbon cutting, carrying a bouquet of sunflowers tied with twine. Inside, the air was warm, alive with the hum of ovens and the low murmur of friends who had come to celebrate. Lucy stood behind the counter, her apron dusted with flour, cheeks flushed from the heat and excitement. When she saw me, her smile deepened. "You're here," she said, as if there had ever been a question. In the center of the display case sat a wedding cake. 3 tiers, frosted in smooth ivory with delicate piping along the edges. At the base was a small card, handwritten in neat script, made with the silver mold and recipes of Helen Carrington, to remind us that love is meant to be shared. So I felt something loosen in my chest. Not pride exactly, but a steadiness. The quiet knowledge that the work of my hands, and the history they carried, would outlive me in a way I could trust. Customers trickled in, drawn by the smell of cinnamon rolls and fresh coffee. I stood to the side watching Lucy greet each person, sliding pastries into paper bags, taking bills with the same careful hands that once shook when folding dough in my kitchen. When the ribbon was cut, applause filled the room, blending with the sound of the door chime. I caught Lucy's eye across the counter. She mouthed, "Thank you."
And I nodded.
Later, as the crowd thinned, she came to stand beside me. "You've given me more than recipes," she said quietly. "You've given me a place to start." I looked around the shop. Sunlight pooling on the wood floor, the air rich with sugar and butter, the walls lined with jars and loaves. "This was always yours to build," I told her. I just held the door open. When I stepped outside, the late afternoon breeze carried the scent of baking down the street. I walked slowly toward home, knowing the legacy was no longer mine alone to guard. It was alive now. In every loaf, every cake, every hand Lucy would teach in her turn. And for the first time in years, the future felt wide open. Helen stepped out of Lucy's new bakery, leaving behind the laughter, the warm scent of fresh bread, and the small card bearing her name as a quiet tribute. The late summer light stretched gold across the street, but her walk home wasn't a return to the past. It was a steady step into the future. Everything worth protecting was safe, and everything worth giving had found the right hands. Not every battle needs noise or confrontation. Sometimes the greatest strength lies in quietly drawing your boundaries, guarding your values, and choosing who is worthy to enter your circle. A true legacy isn't just possessions or heirlooms. It's the story and dignity you pass on to those who will honor them. And sometimes, the sweetest quiet justice is simply living better, free at peace, and no longer defined by anyone else.